Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Designing Effective Rubrics Part 2, presented by Dr. Lance Tomei, the retired Director for Assessment, Accreditation, and Data Management at the University of Central Florida. My name is Katie Kalmus, and I'm the Director for Product and Client Development for LiveText. For those of you on today's webinar that are not so familiar with LiveText, we are an educational software company specializing in the development of assessment technology designed to support and measure student learning. Our implementation and support services help your programs or institution customize the LiveText assessment platform to adapt it to your unique assessment needs, including course-embedded assessment, rubrics aligned to your learning outcomes, field and internship evaluations, and of course, our outstanding ePortfolio product. Our web-based software integrates with your school's learning management systems such as Blackboard, Canvas, or Moodle, as well as the campus student information systems such as Banner or DataTel, to become a seamless part of your learning technology environment. The LiveText platform is extremely student-centered and tracks your students' progress and skills development as they move through their learning experiences, both inside and out of the classroom. Today's presentation is a part of our 2014 Best Practices webinar series, which focuses on important topics in assessment, student learning, and continuous improvement, and is a follow-up to Lance's webinar last May, which is recorded and available on our website. Next month, we have Pepperdine University's business program presenting on an interesting topic, crowdsourcing management education, which received excellent reviews this past summer at the LiveText annual conference. And in January, Dr. David Turbo, Outcomes Assessment Coordinator at the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences, will kick off our 2015 series with a webinar on rubric norming. We encourage you to view and register for our upcoming offerings at www.livetext.com. Also, please mark your calendar for next July. Our annual Assessment and Collaboration Conference is scheduled for July 13th through July 15th in Nashville, Tennessee at the Gaylord Opryland. To learn more, please visit our website. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lance Tomei. Dr. Tomei served as the Director for Assessment, Accreditation, and Data Management at the University of Central Florida from 2005 to 2013. During that same time frame, he also served on UCF's University Assessment Committee, which oversees institutional effectiveness assessment for regional accreditation across the entire university. He chaired the UAC from 2007 to 2009, and again from 2011 to 2013. He currently serves as a CAPE site visit team leader and has chaired multiple site visits for NCAPE in the past. He is a frequent speaker on assessment-related topics at the state, national, and international conferences, and as such, he has a vast background in developing rubrics, using rubrics, and training on the use of rubrics with faculty both at his prior institution and at other institutions. Before joining UCF, Lance's background was with the U.S. Air Force, where he became familiar with the benefits of backwards design and has applied those principles to creating learning outcome assessment systems, including the use of rubrics. On a logistical note, please note that if at any time during the webinar you have questions, you can use the Q&A feature and direct your questions to the host. At the tail end of Lance's presentation, there should be time for questions that will be answered by Lance as time permits. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lance Tomei. Lance, I'll now hand it over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and let me start by welcoming everyone and by thanking LiveText for sponsoring this second Rubric Design webinar this year. What I'd like to do today is revisit a few of the points that we talked about during the May 7th webinar, particularly for those that might be attending this webinar that weren't on board for that prior one. And then we'll move on to some additional topics that are specific to this follow-on or this sequel. I do want to talk a little bit about why designing effective rubrics is important, and we'll discuss some basic issues and attributes of an effective rubric, and then I'll share with you a rubric that I've designed that I think can be used to evaluate the efficacy of other rubrics that you have in use. We'll focus a lot today on common rubric problems, and I'll share some examples of rubrics or extracts from rubrics that I've encountered at different site visits and in working with other institutions as a consultant. And hopefully we'll have ample time at the end for any questions and answers. First, I do want to start with a definition because I'm not sure that everybody, when we use the term rubric, that everybody is thinking exactly the same thing. Some individuals have a very broad definition of a rubric. Some have a much more narrow definition. My personal definition probably is more on the narrow side than some. But I do like the Western Association of Colleges and Schools definition, and that's what you're looking at on this slide. This is consistent with the types of rubrics that we will be discussing today. And I've added the emphasis to the last sentence here because I think it's important to understand that in order to effectively communicate meaningful expectations to students, the rubric must include concrete narrative descriptions of each performance level for each evaluated criterion. We'll discuss this in more detail shortly, but that's probably one of the characteristics in my definition of a rubric that may not exist in some broader definitions of what would constitute a rubric. Why should we even be talking about rubric design at this point in time? Everybody, I think, acknowledges that designing high-quality rubrics is certainly a very challenging and time-consuming task. The first 4 bullets on this slide represent the key points of that conversation. As we all know, the expectations regarding the assessment of student learning continue to rise. And there's also increasing focus on the quality of such assessment data, particularly with regard to validity and reliability. A question we should all be asking ourselves is, do our current rubrics produce valid, reliable, and I would add actionable assessment data? To emphasize the importance of well-designed rubrics in helping to meet heightened demands for high-quality assessment data, I like to use the metaphor of building an arch. The 2 main columns in the arch are the overall assessment system, which consists of things such as your broad plan for assessment, organizational structure that you have to support assessment activities, program-level documentation such as curriculum and assessment maps and the like. And the second arch is the supporting technology that has become so essential to our assessment work. In the case of many in this audience, I'm sure that technology is LiveText. The keystone, which ensures the overall integrity of the arch, is the quality of the assessment instruments being used. The best overall assessment system design supported by the best available technology will fail to produce acceptable results if the rubrics used for key assessments are not well designed. If the keystone fails, so fails the arch. And that's why I think that it's so critical at this point in time that we all look at our existing rubrics and try and elevate the quality of rubrics if we do have concerns about the data that are currently being produced. Here are some fundamental issues in rubric design that I've found over the years, some of the common topics that I think become part of this conversation. The first one, and one that we discussed on May 7th, is the importance of having artifacts that are well articulated with the activity or the artifact to be assessed. Admittedly, when there's a disconnect between that activity or artifact and the rubric used to assess it, it may not be a problem with the rubric, but rather with the activity or the artifact or the instructions for the activity or the artifact. A key question is, if a student carefully follows all instructions for an assignment, will the resulting performance or artifact ensure that an assessor will be able to evaluate all criteria included in the rubric? And that all talks to this first bullet, because the best way to ensure that this alignment can take place is by assessing directed rather than self-selected activities or artifacts. We also discussed on May 7th whether rubrics should be assignment-based or competency-based. And we concluded that this is not necessarily an either-or decision. It's certainly possible to develop a hybrid rubric that is both competency-based and aligned with a specific assignment. And that is, in fact, common practice at many institutions. We spoke about how many levels of performance should be included in a rubric, and we'll come back to this topic a little bit later. How many criteria to include is a somewhat subjective call, and also dependent on other decisions such as whether the rubric will be assignment-based, competency-based, or a hybrid design. For any given rubric, however, the best answer is that all critical indicators for the competency or competencies to be assessed should be included as separate criteria. The decision to use a linear or nonlinear approach is primarily an assessment system design decision, but that decision will subsequently impact on rubric design. In a linear approach, rubrics are competency-based, and each rubric assesses a single key competency. In a nonlinear approach, hybrid rubrics are more common, with each assessed activity or artifact and the associated rubric incorporating multiple competencies. We also briefly discussed holistic versus analytic grading and quickly determined that analytic grading is far more likely to produce actionable data. So that's a quick recap of some of the key points from our May 7th discussions. What are some of the things that you should look for in an effective rubric? Again, the first item is to ensure that the rubric and the assessed activity or artifact are well articulated. Construct and content validity are also important. Essentially, this means that you're assessing the right outcome or outcomes, and you're assessing all of the important elements of that outcome or those outcomes. There are additional aspects of validity, such as concurrent or convergent validity, which really talks to getting consistent results on multiple assessments of the same outcomes at approximately the same time, and predictive validity. In other words, does strong performance on an assessment accurately predict future success on the job? The use of double or multiple barrel criteria or performance descriptors should be avoided whenever possible. We'll look at the consequences of violating this principle shortly. Performance descriptors should provide concrete distinctions between performance levels and collectively should address all possible performance levels. There should be no overlap between levels and no gaps between levels. Using highly subjective terms, or what I refer to as inconsequential terms to distinguish between levels, defeats the primary purpose for using a rubric in the first place, which is to minimize subjectivity in what is normally by nature a very subjective assessment activity. Finally, an effective rubric produces actionable data that can help inform decisions about improving student learning performance, as well as decisions about improving program quality. So here's the meta rubric that I referred to earlier that I've designed to help evaluate the efficacy of other rubrics. And it's a pretty basic rubric, only 4 criteria here. There are a couple of reasons for that. And by the way, actionability you don't see on the list, and there's a reason for that as well. First, you'll need to see actual assessment data before you can really determine whether or not a rubric is producing actionable data. Secondly, and more importantly, if you achieve mastery in the 4 listed criteria, the resulting rubric should indeed produce actionable data. So producing actionable data is not so much a design criterion in and of itself, as it is a direct consequence of meeting the other 4 design criteria that you see in this meta rubric. Some common rubric problems that I've encountered in the field are listed on this slide. Perhaps the most common is including one or more levels of performance that exceed the target outcome. In other words, multiple levels of mastery. This is a very common practice. And what I found is that it often leads to the use of highly subjective descriptors to distinguish between these levels, or the use of inconsequential terms to differentiate between these levels. And in some cases, and perhaps the worst scenario, the degradation of the level intended to represent mastery to a level of performance that actually falls short of the target learning outcome as a means to distinguish between that level and higher levels of, quote, mastery. All of this obviously would have a negative effect on reliability. Another common problem is using double or multiple barrel criteria or performance descriptors. These often lead to other problems as well. It can easily result in failing to include all possible outcomes, and in most cases will have a negative impact on actionability. And we'll look at a specific example of that. There's actually one example of a multiple barrel performance descriptor in that meta rubric, and we'll go back to that and talk about it in a bit. Using overlapping descriptors will certainly have a negative impact on reliability, because that essentially means you've got multiple performance levels that could be assigned to the same level of performance, or multiple grades that could be assigned to the same level of performance. So that's clearly going to have a negative impact on reliability. And a lot of these problems, I think, are the result of attempting to use one rubric to capture both competency-aligned performance data and to generate a more traditional course assignment grade. In fact, a lot of the rubrics that I've looked at that have multiple levels of mastery, it seems implicit when you look at the rubrics that those multiple levels are intended to distinguish between, quote, an A student and a B student, or in some cases an A, B, and C student, and so on. And doing that does create additional challenges, as we've said. Another commonly encountered problem is the lack of performance descriptors altogether. So a matrix that has nothing but a series of criteria and an array of performance levels, and you simply check in the cell that reflects the performance level for each criterion, but there's no narrative description to tell you what that performance at that level should look like, what you should be seeing. Also, there's a common problem where the use of descriptors, or the narrative descriptors that are in the cells, are nothing more than surrogates for the performance levels themselves, and they don't really provide any useful information to help you make distinctions, clear, concrete distinctions between performance levels. Well, the best way to show you the types of things that I've encountered and why these types of problems are an area that I'm concerned with now and that I'm working with a lot of institutions on, is to show you some examples. These are extracts, in most cases a single criterion from a larger rubric, that I've seen in actual rubrics in use in the field. So here's the first example. And in this example, you can see multiple levels of mastery, proficient and distinguished. What look like performance descriptors are, in this case, a good example of that type of subjective surrogate for the performance levels themselves. Highly subjective. Would all faculty be consistent in making clear distinctions between a weak, a relatively weak, and a moderate degree of understanding? And would the students know what that difference is and what would constitute those different levels of performance? The proficient level also seems to fall short of where you would want to see a student at the end of a program. If you look at this realistically, you'll probably quickly conclude that the distinguished level has actually become the desired learning outcome. And most of the times when I see rubrics of this type and I'm looking at the associated data, the vast majority of the students are being rated at the distinguished level, which has become the de facto mastery. And again, when that happens, often the proficient level becomes less than what you would want at program completion, and yet it's all that's required for a candidate to be exited from a program. So obviously an inherent danger there. Here's another example, and this is a clear-cut example of multiple levels of mastery and no substantive concrete performance descriptors, simply surrogates for the performance level labels themselves. The criterion itself is also very broad. Are there critical indicators for quality of writing that should be listed as separate rubric criteria? I would suggest probably yes. And if you're familiar with the AAC and you value rubrics and you look at the rubric for written communication, you'll know there are a number of different criteria broken down in that rubric. Thinking back to our definition, our broad definition of a rubric, how does this rubric communicate any expectations to students whatsoever? Here's a third example, and at first glance, this might look like a reasonably good rubric example. In fact, there are multiple problems present here. First, We don't know how many total parts are in the lesson, so there could be a gap between developing and proficient, but we don't know that. We have no way to determine that from looking at this. Secondly, unsatisfactory and developing performance descriptors are single-barreled. The proficient level descriptor is double-barreled, and the distinguished level is triple-barreled. This rubric also implies that a student would be considered proficient even if the instructional materials were not developmentally appropriate. So another example of, for lack of a better term, the dummying down, if you will, of the proficient level, and likely done in an attempt to make a clear-cut distinction between that level and distinguished, but there's an obvious negative unintended consequence there. Once again, the distinguished level appears to represent the actual target learning outcome. This is yet another example of how multiple levels of mastery can result in problems. Not only does proficient obviously fall short of what should be expected at program completion, but this rubric does not include all possible outcomes. What if the P12 standards are aligned to the learning objectives but are not age appropriate? Here's yet another example of multiple levels of mastery. But the main issue that I'm concerned with in this rubric is the overlap between unsatisfactory and developing. What would be the correct grade for someone who made 2 errors when describing learning activity instructions for students? There'd be 2 possible answers here with an obvious detriment to inter-rater reliability. The primary concern with example 6 is that the criterion being assessed is very broad and probably should be broken down to its critical elements. As a result of the broad criterion, multiple barrel descriptors are present. The flow from one level of performance to the next is very disjointed due to different indicators appearing at different levels. For example, only the developing level talks about assessing instructional goals. As a result, there are lots of possible outcomes that would not be reflected in this rubric's performance descriptors. Think back again to the WASC description of a rubric, particularly the area where I added the emphasis about communicating information to students. A good rubric is a learning scaffold for the students, and while this instrument certainly is in the form of a table or matrix with criteria that describe the dimensions of the outcomes down the left-hand vertical axis and the levels of performance across the horizontal axis, which, by the way, is a direct quote from that WASC definition, it does fall well short when it comes to communicating expectations to students. About the only thing you're doing here is telling students what you consider to be the critical indicators, but there's no indication of what any of the different levels of performance for any of those critical indicators or elements of the rubric would look like. Obviously, if it's not communicating that to students, it's not communicating that to faculty who are doing the grading. So what you're going to get here is a 100% subjective evaluation of student performance for each of the criteria, again, defeating the entire purpose of having a rubric in the first place. This, by the way, is one of those rubrics that when I look at one like this and see something like this, what I'm seeing across the titles is not need significant improvement to excellent. I'm seeing F, D, C, B, A grades, and I think that's why a lot of these types of rubrics exist in practice. This is the last example that we're going to look at today, and I thought I should probably give you one example of what I call an inconsequential term. If you look at the acceptable and the target level, you'll notice that the only thing that's different is at the acceptable level, the learning activity is described in an accurate manner, and at the target level, it's clearly described in an accurate manner. Not necessarily subjective, but in my mind, simply inconsequential. I don't know how something can be described in an accurate manner if it's not clear. So again, this is yet another example of the kinds of challenges that people have to try and overcome when they have multiple levels of mastery embedded embedded in their rubrics for key assessments. So let me shift the discussion a little bit, and let's look at some common templates that I often see. And this is probably the most common example that I see in practice. It's a 4-level rubric that's used for one formative assessment and one summative assessment, but has 2 levels of mastery. Again, the most common one out there. This use of 2 levels of mastery is extremely common, and I suspect it's driven by faculty desire to be able to recognize those truly exceptional students. And I understand that. So I'll give you a concept or a strategy. If you insist that this is the type of rubric you want to use, there's a way I think that you can go about this that will minimize the potential dangers of this design. So what I would suggest is almost anything that you read about designing rubrics will tell you that as you start populating the performance descriptors, work from the lowest level to the highest level, or work from the highest level to the lowest level. And I'm going to suggest an alternative to that. If you want to keep this type of rubric in place in your institutions, I would strongly suggest that the first column you populate is the proficient column, and you make absolutely certain that you maintain the integrity of what your target learning outcomes are, and those are captured accurately in that proficient column, and then work outward in both directions. You have to somehow come up with what it is that sets that it's truly exemplary or extraordinary or distinguished student, whatever label you want to put on that mastery plus column. You've got to figure out what are those different things you're seeing that aren't required for program completion that your truly exceptional students are demonstrating. And that's how you have to distinguish that additional level. So you can do it, but do it with great caution. And always understand the fundamental reality that every time you add a level of performance to a rubric, you are increasing the challenge for inter-rater reliability. So if you're going to go down that path, do it with great care. And I think the best strategy, again, is to start with that proficient column and work from there outward in both directions. This, again, is a common 5-level rubric template that I see. And this is almost explicitly capturing what's really going on here, which is that FDCBA grading criteria being forced into a rubric-type format. The attempt to capture both competency-aligned performance data and course grading data from a single rubric here is pretty obvious. And again, it just poses, I think, an awful lot of challenges to come up with good standards-aligned performance data with a high degree of reliability. Here's a better option that I would recommend for a 4-level rubric, and it involves 2 formative assessments. So you're going to do a couple of checkpoints as your students are going through a program, and then obviously the summative assessment at the end to ensure that they acquire the target learning outcomes and demonstrate those adequately. And I like this design because there are some really good examples out there available to all of us to take a look at. So I'll share one of those with you. Most of you are probably familiar with the AAC and U-value rubrics. There are 16 of these. They're commonly used at a lot of institutions to measure institutional level outcomes, primarily gen ed related outcomes like written communication, oral communication, critical thinking. This one happens to be for information literacy. You'll note that the direction of the rubric, it goes opposite from the rubrics, all the examples that I've shown you. It doesn't really matter which way your rubrics go, from low to high or high to low, other than the fact that I would strongly advise that you be consistent at your institution, that all your rubrics go in the same direction. This particular direction, for those of you using live text, may be more desirable just because in your color-coded reports, the lowest level is the one that would be assigned the red color, which some people just think that red color should be associated with the danger zone, if you will, the lowest possible rating. So if you want the color coding, the bar graphs and live text to support your preferred color scheme, then the highest on the left, lowest on the right is probably the way to go for live text rubrics. And I'll give you one more example. This is an option for a 3-level rubric, and For all of you who have the 4-level rubrics in place that use that multiple or 2 levels of mastery, you could simply eliminate the last column and make sure that your 1 level of mastery does in fact reflect your target learning outcomes, and not worry about having multiple levels of mastery. So this will simplify things and certainly should improve your inter-rater reliability and produce better data. So a few thoughts before we start taking Q&A. In developing rubrics for key formative and summative assessments, be sure that you're thinking about both effectiveness and efficiency. Identify critical indicators for target learning outcomes and incorporate those into your rubric. So it's really important that in doing this work, you identify a manageable number of key formative and key summative assessments, which is why I suggest to people that the nonlinear approach, where you have good, strong, robust activities that capture a number of competencies in a single, very strong and powerful assessment activity, is a more efficient approach than trying to do a linear approach where you try to develop separate assessments for each individual competency that you need to assess. For each outcome or competency, identify the critical indicators, and those critical indicators become the assess criteria in your rubrics. Limit the number of performance levels to the minimum needed to meet your assessment requirements. Again, try to avoid the use of multiple levels of mastery. If you choose to use the multiple levels, be sure that the lowest level of mastery reflects the true target learning outcomes. If you can do that and still be sure that your rubric meets the other qualities of an effective rubric, using multiple levels of mastery will make rubric, you can do that, but you just have to make sure you adhere to all of those criteria, and it's going to be an increased challenge if you have multiple levels of mastery. It will be certainly more challenging, not necessarily impossible. That said, lots of real-world examples, and we've looked at several today, demonstrate the problems that so often surface when multiple levels of mastery are included in rubrics. Be sure your performance descriptors make clear, concrete distinctions between performance levels. Avoid the use of highly subjective or inconsequential terms to distinguish between levels of performance. For each criterion, the various performance level descriptors should collectively include all possible outcomes while also avoiding overlaps between levels. Avoid the use of multiple barrel criteria. If each barrel is a critical indicator for a competency, then make each one a separate criterion. Also try to avoid the use of multiple barrel performance descriptors. Even when done with great care, resulting assessment data may be valid and reliable, but not directly actionable. So let's go back and look again at that meta rubric, and we can look at the example that is built into that rubric. So if you look at the last element here, quality of performance descriptors, and you read across the 3 performance level descriptors there, you'll note that they meet all of the criteria, but the second column, the developing column, does have 2 barrels. It's a double-barreled performance descriptor. In this particular case, this probably won't cause a particular problem, which is why I have it built in here, because my belief is that if you're using this rubric to evaluate rubrics and you find a rubric that you determine is at that developing level, you're immediately going to know which of those barrels is missing, because you're going to make a note of what needs to be done to try and remedy that. But if you think about a typical rubric where you're going to run a report on this and you're going to see assessment data, and you may see that you have a large number of students being evaluated at the developing level, what you'll know is you're looking for 2 descriptors. One of them is present and one is not, but you won't know which one is routinely missing or whether it's always the same one. And therein lies the challenge to actionability. So even when you do this with great care to make sure that all possible outcomes are there, that you've got clear, distinct differences between the performance levels, you're still likely to lose a level of actionability if you have multiple barrels in your narrative performance descriptors. So back to the summary slide. There are 3 specific strategies that I think you can use to help ensure construct and content validity of your key assessment rubrics. Number 1 is to recognize that assessment needs to be faculty-driven and owned. Your most knowledgeable faculty should have the primary responsibility for designing key assessment activities and the associated assessment instruments. Secondly, align your key assessments to applicable standards or competencies. And finally, be sure that you are actively engaging your stakeholders in the design of your key assessments. Get them in on the front end of this work, not after you're done. Don't ask them to take a look and give you feedback. You want them at the table when you're developing your key assessment instruments. Also, don't leave reliability to chance. Faculty who will be responsible for rubric development should be trained on rubric design. And all faculty who will use assessment rubrics should be trained on the use of those rubrics. Once you start putting rubrics into place, be sure you're checking your actual assessment data for reliability, particularly inter-rater reliability. To achieve the maximum benefit from rubric use, make your assessment system and all key rubrics transparent. In other words, make sure that your students see what the expectations are. Once you have really well-designed rubrics, if you make those available to students in advance, you will almost by definition improve student learning outcomes. And one final observation for those of you involved in educator preparation. Kate just announced at its fall conference 2 weeks ago that it would be requiring submission of all key assessment instruments 3 years prior to future reaccreditation site visits. This is, of course, once their timeline is fully implemented under the new standards. But the fact that they're going to be collecting your assessment instruments, and that means if you're submitting data from rubrics, you're going to be submitting the rubrics 3 years prior to the site visit. Likewise with survey instruments and the like. This sends a clear signal on the importance of ensuring the quality of your key assessment rubrics, and that's the only way that you can ensure that you're going to be able to make a strong case that what you're producing is valid, reliable data to support that you are meeting the standards. And with that, I will open the session up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lance, for a very informative discussion. It's always great to hear you talk about rubrics and rubric design. We actually had some really excellent questions coming in over the course of the presentation. And before we get into the questions, I just wanted to announce to all participants that a copy of the PowerPoint and a recorded link to today's webinar will actually be emailed to each of you after the presentation is over. So rest assured, you'll get not only the PowerPoint, but actually a link to the recorded webinar. Okay, so moving back to the questions, Lance. One of the first questions that came in that was actually in my mind as I was looking at the rubrics as well was, you addressed it to some point in the middle part of the presentation, but just to reiterate, do you really see a benefit, or does it really not matter if you have the highest levels of the rubrics, the highest performance levels, starting at the left or ending at the right? And the question came in, and it had mentioned that we want the students to actually focus on the best, correct? And if we read from left to right, and you start with the highest performance level on the left, then that might be the concept that actually sticks with students. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my personal preference is go lowest to highest from left to right, and as I've designed rubrics over time, I've always done that. But again, I have had some live text users that have observed and mentioned to me that when they do that, then the color coding on the graphs, the graphical portrayal they get of their assessment data seems counterintuitive because the far right bar is red, which a lot of people associate with bad. So to avoid that, a lot of people that use live text, or at least some people using live text, have their rubrics go in the other direction. But it's really driven not by what's right for a rubric. It's really driven by the way that those graphs display in live text and the color coding associated with that. My personal preference, again, I like the left to right mode, but you'll notice that the AAC and U-value rubrics, which are commonly used out there, go the other route. They go highest on the left, lowest on the right. So to me, the most important thing probably is don't be inconsistent. What you don't need is your students looking at a rubric in one course it goes right to left, and in another course it goes left to right. I think as long as you're consistent throughout your institution, or at least throughout at the program level or within the EPP, for those of you in educator preparation, I would make sure that they all go in the same direction. And I've actually been to a number of institutions where different rubrics flow in different directions, and I think that's particularly problematic for students.
Yeah, absolutely. Then there was a couple questions that came in that were around multiple levels of mastery. And I really enjoyed the thoughts that you had around really thinking, what's proficient versus mastery or proficient versus exemplary. And you really, when you're looking at the data after you collect information, if you've got these multiple levels of mastery, in past conversations with you, Lance, like we've talked about really that being one of the biggest challenges, is that if students are typically falling into that highest level of performance expectation as opposed to really meeting the criteria that you're actually looking for at the proficient level. Can you discuss, Lance, some of the problems, some of the typical problems that you'll see around multiple levels of mastery?
Well, typically when I see, first of all, there are two things that I look at. When I look at basic rubrics and I see multiple levels of mastery, I'm looking, again, are there clear, concrete distinctions between levels, and does the lowest level of mastery reflect an appropriate target learning outcome, or is there clearly a deficiency embedded in that description that should not be acceptable for program completion? And we looked at a couple of examples where clearly that level had been dummied down for some reason, and I don't think any of us would actually want students to graduate at that particular level. The other thing that I always look at is the actual data. And in most institutions, and if you have these types of rubrics, go look at your own data. That's what I would suggest to everybody who's in attendance. And I would be surprised if you have rubrics that have two levels, let's say 2 levels of mastery. On your summative assessments, I would bet that the vast majority of you will find that in excess of 90% of your students are being rated at the very highest level. And because that's what I see in the data routinely. If you've got a good balance, then you may have done a good job in distinguishing clearly between those 2 levels in an appropriate manner as well. But having that type of data is very rare. What happens is everything tends to have that halo effect, and it winds up at the very far end of that rubric. If somebody's meeting where you expect them to be, they're going to get that highest level most of the time. And that, for me, becomes problematic because it suggests that you either set your target learning outcomes too low or there's something wrong with the way the performances are being evaluated. If you've got the target learning outcome at the proficient level and 95% of your students are being rated distinguished, they're just implicit in the data, there's something wrong there. So to me, and I think when we're talking about a new world in terms of what the expectations are for the quality of evidence that you're submitting in support of accreditation and accountability, those types of data issues and those types of rubric problems are going to become far more important than what they may have been in the past. And let me delve into one other area, because one of the arguments that I've heard from faculty for wanting to have the extra levels is they're worried that with fewer levels, the data won't be as actionable. And I understand that. They're looking for higher resolution. And if you can get higher resolution and do it correctly, then fine, go for it. But what I see very often is you may have more levels and you may think that creates more actionability, but when everything winds up defaulting to the highest level, you're really not learning anything useful for program improvement. What you really want to determine is, are all of your students acquiring mastery? If not, what's going wrong? What are the indicators that are not being met? And that's what that mid-level or that level 2 in the rubric is going to hopefully help you understand. So to me, actionability, the more important thing for actionability is that you have highly reliable data, Resolution's important, but not at the expense of reliability.
I think actually that one of the earlier questions that came in, and this is a great segue to it, was asking if you could please address the hot mess rubric, one that has so many levels and granular details that it's not functional. And I think that's basically what you were just describing, Lance, which is how this rubric can evolve to have to basically have so many different levels that when you actually go to apply it and use it to evaluate student work, you're not really getting any actionable data out of the back end of it.
Yeah, the more levels you add, the more likely it is, from my experience, and I've looked at thousands of rubrics in a lot of different institutions, my experience is that higher levels leads to extreme use of subjective terms to distinguish between levels or inconsequential terms, and you're just not going to get very good data from those types of things. One of the challenges, again, and I think a lot of times those extra levels are associated with faculty's need to also assign a grade to that activity for course grading. What I suggested to faculty, and what I know, the approach that I would personally take is, if you have a good, efficient assessment system in place for your key assessments, in a typical course, you might have one or two key assessments that are program-level key assessments. And those may be 10% or 20% of that course grade. If you've already determined that those are the critical assessments and they're evaluating the critical competencies in the program, if a student is where you expect them to be, so if they're at the developing stage on a formative assessment and that's where they're supposed to be, on that assignment, don't worry about distinguishing A students from B students. You've got lots of other stuff you're grading in that course that can help you with that. I would send a clear signal to my students that this is a really important assessment if you're where you're expected to be, because this is something we're using to measure your progress through the program to make sure you're on track. If you do everything that you're expected to do on this assessment at this point in time, you get an A for this one.
Right.
To me, it would be cut and dried. Anyone that met the requirement would get an A in that particular assessment. And then all the other stuff that's graded in that course is how I would distinguish between A students and B students and C students. So I think that sends a couple of important messages to students, that you're really about capturing performance, that you've identified critical performance indicators that you need to see at that particular point in time, and that if they get it right, they're going to be rewarded for that.
Great. And I feel like this next question, which I want to read, because I do feel like it's a great question, and I think we may have addressed it already, but if you have anything to add, Lance, let me know. But the observation was, I have observed a shift in the way faculty design rubrics. They end up adding a great deal to rubrics, which end up becoming checklists. This is done in part because students often follow the rubric only instead of following both the assignment description and the rubric. Can you speak to this issue?
Well, to some degree, that talks to the concept that I mentioned in the presentation, which is articulation of the rubric and the directions for the assignment, the artifact or the activity that's going to be assessed using that rubric. But I think it's important that you do establish, for these key assessments, you're looking for the critical indicators. I think we all have to accept that there's no perfect assessment, nor is there any way for us to ever evaluate everything that a student knows and is able to do. So whatever we do in the area of assessment is sampling to some level. So the question is, what's that degree of sampling? What's appropriate for key assessments for accountability and accreditation?
Right.
All I can do is share a strategy that I used when I was at the University of Central Florida, because I'll admit this was a difficult thing. I tried working through faculty committees to get faculty to identify the critical indicators for each of the Florida standards, the state standards, which are the Florida Educator Accomplished Practices. Now, this took place several years ago. Those standards have been revised and look very different today than they did then. But at that point in time, there were 12 standards, and there were two different lists of state indicators. And I tried to get faculty to determine which ones we were going to assess. What did we consider to be the must-see indicators, or the critical indicators for each of the standards? And when I couldn't get that done working at program level, working with interdisciplinary committees, I tried lots of different approaches. What I finally did was send a survey out to all faculty, because these are common standards. They're not program specific. So I sent a survey out to all faculty that listed the standards and included the list of both sets of the state sample indicators for each standard. And I told the faculty, or asked the faculty, to give me their top 3. And I said, if you absolutely have to see 4 or 5, that's it, but no more than 5. And then I also said, if there's an indicator that's nowhere on the state list of sample indicators that you think is a critical indicator, write it in. And I simply tallied the survey results, and I actually found very clear cut points, usually after the top 3 or 4 indicators for each standard. And we built our summative assessment for student teaching around the indicators that faculty collectively told me via survey were the must-see indicators. So is that a perfect system? No. But did it get the job done? Did it give us a high degree of confidence that if we saw those 3 or 4 indicators for each standard, that standard was being met at the target level? I think we were in a pretty good place there. So it's challenging work. You have to figure out a strategy how you're going to go about doing that. It is absolutely important that you identify what are the critical indicators, and don't lose sight of that effective and efficient. So try to avoid that laundry list of indicators and find out the ones that are absolutely essential for you to feel comfortable about saying that a particular student has acquired a given competency.
Right. And I think we also have a number of questions that are coming in around grading and program level rubrics. And one of the questions is, can you talk about how to best assign points to well-designed rubrics if we are using them for traditional grading of projects for a course? And then, on a similar vein, the question came in asking, should a percentage range always be noted in each performance column of a rubric to assist with grading?
Well, personally, I'm absolutely opposed to trying to do 2 things with a single rubric. So I don't think there's any way to do that well. If you're going to try and assign a point value, or you want to be able to assign a range of point values for each level of performance, the question I would then ask is, how are you going to demonstrate the reliability of the data? How do you distinguish, for example, if you say that the top level of performance can be given a numerical grade anywhere from 90 to 100, how do you distinguish meaningfully between a 90 and a 95? If you're giving an objective test, you don't need a rubric. Normally the activity is very subjective. So to my way of thinking, if you're going to do this, and you're going to also try and overlay a grade, and you don't take my strategy, which is, look, if they're where you need them to be at this point in time, you give them an A on this assignment and be done with it. Right. And at whatever point value that would equate to, you can determine what that's going to be and just give that. It's either they're there or they're at some lesser level if they don't meet expectations. But if you want to put a point value on, when I think about, and I'll use the live text example, you can capture the live text data, and then you can also assign a grade using that grade box in the live text as you're grading in a live text rubric, which for those of you that have the fully integrated system will automatically populate into your LMS gradebook.
Yeah.
That's going to be a subjective decision. Don't try and make it look objective. Don't try and make it look like you're adhering to the descriptions in the rubrics, because there's really no highly reliable way in my mind to do that. I think you've got to differentiate those 2 tasks. And if you want to put a subjective grade on there, fine, do it for course grading purposes, but don't try and embed that information into the data that you're going to present for accreditation, because you're going to have a very difficult time making a strong case for the quality of the data, the reliability of the data that you're presenting.
So I think the next question in this vein, which is also a very good one, what are some practical suggestions that faculty can use to avoid equating a rubric with traditional grading?
I think it's just getting your arms around the whole concept of what we're trying to do here, which is go beyond the traditional grading methodology. And this is where the whole concept of reverse engineering how we think about an academic program, if you accept that where we really need to start is by establishing the student learning outcome, the target learning outcomes at the program level, and then we build the key assessments, that the assessments that we're talking about are designed specifically to monitor students' acquisition and mastery of those competencies, then that ought to be our primary driver. Those are your most important student learning outcomes, and grading to me is actually a secondary concern. I know it's something that we all have to deal with, but I just try and avoid confusing the two things, and that's why I have the more simple approach of on these key assessments. If they meet your expectations, whether it's at a formative level or a summative level, for that particular assignment, you give them an A. If you have to add a grade for course grading purposes.
Right.
That's just my personal way. It's a real simple way to go about this. I think, again, it sends a powerful signal to the students that these are the assessments that we're using to make sure that we're fulfilling our promise to you, that if you're successful in this program, you're going to leave here with a set of knowledges and skills that we promised you, that we've set as target learning outcomes for this program. I think it's a relatively new arena for most of us to think that way about assessment. But to me, it's a very integral part of teaching and learning, and in this case, the most important part. To me, it transcends the importance of assigning grades.
So I think this next question, and we've got time for just two more questions. So this next one, I think, dovetails into what you were describing very nicely. And the question was, can you address the difference between a rubric used formatively and a rubric used summatively? Do you see rubrics as different for those different functions? Does it really matter?
Well, you can design a rubric just for a formative assessment, and you can design a rubric just for a summative assessment, or you can design rubrics that can be used for both. And again, the example that the one real-world example I gave was the AAC and U-value rubric. I like having a rubric design for the key competencies, the key learning outcomes, that's used for both formative and summative, because it's the best way to ensure that your formative assessments are well articulated with your summative assessments. I actually had a program at my former institution where they evaluated the same competencies both formatively and summatively, but they actually used different critical indicators on the formative assessments for some competencies than on the summative. So when a student ran into difficulty with a particular indicator at the summative level, there had been no forewarning that that was coming, because that indicator was not included in the formative assessment. So you need to have that good articulation as they go through the program, and I think that's important that you do that. So I like that design. In all these discussions, when I use the term formative or summative, I'm always talking about at the program level. Mm-hmm. And so some faculty look at rubrics, if it's a final exam, a rubric on some type of final exam in a course, they think it's a summative assessment, and from a course perspective it is. But from a program perspective, if that's also serving as one of the key formative assessments for the program, then in my conversations, I'm considering that a formative assessment. So, and that's the context. I always talk at the program level context, because that's what you really need, is you need to be looking at an array of formative assessments across the program that collectively assess all of the core competencies, all of the key learning outcomes, and again, an array of summative assessments to do the same thing. So the summative are going to come predominantly at the end of the program or close to the end of the program, the vast majority. The formative assessments can be spread out through different phases. Some people want to take specific snapshots at points in time. Transition points is a term that formerly NCAPE used to use. CAPE, if you look at the new CAPE standards, and there's an element in Standard 3 that talks about ensuring the quality as candidates progress through a program. It's the same concept of taking snapshots at certain points in time to make sure that they're on track. So to me, those are all formative assessments, because in most of those cases, they're not going to be at the end game yet. That will come later in the program.
And I think that dovetails really nicely into our final question, which is, how would you define mastery? Is it above target?
To me, the terms are synonymous. So, and I actually do like the term target, because you're telling people that that's where you're supposed to be at the end of the program.
Okay, great. Well, Lance, thank you so much. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time, and thank you for all the attendees that have joined us, and thank you for all your great questions as well. Lance, it's always a pleasure. We look forward to our next webinar with you, which we'll work with Vicki to actually coordinate and schedule. But I want to thank everybody for your participation today, and Lance, especially for you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thanks to all the attendees.